I'm struck by part of what you're doing is raising up to the surface the ism that we're living in. We have internalized racism, we've internalized sexism, we've internalized ageism, I would also suggest. We've internalized commercialism, and that is the way to solve problems. This room, many of us were designers, we're makers, we're builders. And so the question I have for you is, what question should we ask ourselves as people who unwittingly have also absorbed a lot of these isms as we design solutions, quote unquote, as we design things for the world? What should we challenge
It's a
ourselves?
great question. I mean, I'll say a couple things. I don't know how helpful they are. One, if you agree with me that we kind of have to shift our weight from one foot to the other, from a private spirited age to a public spirited age, choose what you're designing for. Part of what's happened is, like, in an age like ours, all the money and therefore all the good design is private. Like, part of what happens in the kind of age we're living is, like, everything's privatized, and the social good is privatized. And so that may mean doing projects at a lower rate or pro bono for the city and the country, and, like, helping the country have better design in all the million ways that's, and not in the parachute in way, but actually, like, embedding in communities and understanding, what that means. The other thing I'd say is design. I mean, I'm not an expert in design, obviously, but even in something as innocuous as design, there's often values, choices embedded. And I think in some ways, design has been hijacked a little bit by the frictionless win-win, like, solutions that don't require change, solutions that don't require system fixes. There's a little bit of a bias, I think, towards, like, the engine kind of approach. And so I think thinking about, like, what's a justice-based paradigm in design, where you're not trying to just make things more efficient or beautiful within the framework, but, like, raise questions about the framework. Yeah.
Hi, Anand. Thank you for this book. It's articulated a lot of things that I felt in my personal career. I was wondering what you thought for the near-term future, what the best way for the left to build power is in terms of strategies and tactics.
I think it's very simple. It's movements, and movements are not tweets, and they're not pokes, and they're not likes, and they're not chat groups, and they're not Slack groups, and they are actual communities of people. Like, if you haven't barbecued with someone, you're not in a movement with them, right? If, like, they haven't been to your house, you're not in a movement with them. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I think we have forgotten. The digital age has created a temptation for us to think we are in community when we're alone.
Right.
And I was listening to Doris Kearns Goodwin the other day, the historian, and she was saying, she's someone who has, like, a lot of experience about what these moments in American history were like, and they were gloomy ones, and there was the Civil War and others. This is not the only bad time in American history. And she's also an expert in, like, how we got out of each one of those, and the answer is movements. The reality is, like, we should talk about the fact that by any historical standard, if you look at the Me Too movement, which has been about a year of the Me Too movement, right? By any yardstick, one of the most impressive and important movements in American history. But it's lopsided. It's extraordinary as a media movement, as a conversation movement. It got 325 million, actually more than that, outside this country, talking about one thing. Amazing, right? But I think people from other generations would have asked, how many city councils passed new ordinances because of that movement? How many states passed new law? I mean, New York is totally run by liberals. Has New York City passed any new laws because of the Me Too movement? I'm sure everybody in the government of New York City thinks it's a great movement. Have any of them introduced any new laws? I don't know. Maybe they have. I don't think so.
Actually, I think what has to happen in order for the Me Too movement to really take hold in systemic change is for us to be able to get the one last state we need to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. That would make real change happen.
Yes. But that's still a hard thing. Like, what I'm saying is, even where sympathetic people rule the roost, There's something in our age that makes us satisfied with generating heat and light and conversation and awareness, but not passing things. And I think that's part of this culture that is just a market-based culture. And if we relearn movements, where people are at our homes, we're talking, these are people you know over a period of years. You also read Malcolm Gladwell's piece about the civil rights movement versus the Arab Spring, and like the difference between a Twitter revolution and people who like deeply know each other over years and are actually willing to take risks together. There's a reason the civil rights movement went the way it did versus the Arab Spring. And I just think that's very, very important. We need to read the history of how we did that. These tech tools could have the effect of making us feel connected when we're not, but these tech tools are also incredibly powerful tools for making real connections and sustaining them if we choose to use them that way, right? But we haven't really.
Yeah, I equate Occupy in that sort of Arab Spring category as well. Change that wasn't able to really take hold.
And by the way, Occupy absolutely changed the conversation.
Yeah.
This 1%, 99% was not the frame in the world until it did that. That's very important, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But it didn't change a tax rate.
Exactly.
We have one over here.
And then we have another person over here as well.
Hey, I'm over here. I'm going to keep on the party hat because I think
So great.
let's start a trend of black males wearing party hats.
Yes.
Maybe that'll change things.
Exactly.
I grew
That's
up in
some
the,
real change.
I grew up in the Northeast, which puts us in this same bubble that you're talking about, this liberal movement. What I find really amazing for the last year and a half to 2 years is that Orange Mussolini has really pushed white males, white females, people that aren't or weren't ready to stand up for what they partially believed in, into a new bracket of talking about it way more amongst themselves, which I think is really amazing. The question is, how do you and I, how does this room go about not scaring the crap out of those people for the next 5 to 10 years and gently pushing them along and giving them more power to keep on?
Waking up.
Yeah, how do we keep the gently waking on that path to being woke, right? We're woke, but what we're dealing with is people that are gently waking, running back. How do we foster that thought process?
That's great. I mean, first of all, I want to say I do not, and I think this is really important, I do not think it is the job of the woke to educate the waking or anybody else. I do think it is in the self-interest of those among the woke who feel they can handle it to try to rig the society in the direction of more wokeness, right? But I want to separate those two things because like I am not, and I having been through this a lot myself, like it is not my job to make white people who don't think I belong here see the light. Like that's not my job. However, the stove experience haunts me as a story of potential that is often squandered, right? And so I think we got to hold those two ideas first of all. It's not women's job to educate men about their dignity, right? But at the margin, I do think there are ways we can have these conversations about everything, about the new America that's rising, that are exclusionary when we're talking about inclusion, and there are ways of having those same conversations that are inclusive in spirit when we're talking about inclusion, right? I think there are ways of getting fussy about terminology that, to me, distract us from what's in people's hearts. I actually don't mind if someone doesn't quite, if people sometimes, ask like if are you a Hindi, because they don't know the difference in the language. Like, yeah, that's a little funny and it's a little bad that they don't know that, but that is different from someone not wanting me to be in this country. And sometimes we conflate awkwardness and just simply just not having had the background of being from the open cosmopolitan America with hatred. And I think that just drives people, that makes them feel like, okay, the other people are my people. And so, I had this experience last year of speaking at the Obama summit in Chicago, and I say it only because I had the very humiliating and humbling, I should say, experience of saying an idea and then having Barack Obama summarize it like so much better than I could have ever said it, which is really like, he was always good, but when you hear your own idea being said so much better than you could say it, you just actually realize how talented the person is. So I had said something about the woke and the waking thing, and so then he got up and was taking the plenary, and he's like, he said my name wrong, which is proof that even he is not quite as woke as he might be. And he said, the way he summarized it was, what we need to understand is, we can't have a politics that starts with, you don't get me because. You don't get me because I'm a woman, you don't get me because I'm black, you don't get me because I'm white, you don't get me because I'm young. If that's our starting point, we have a politics without the possibility of persuasion. Politics is all about persuasion, right? It's not about protection, right? Because then you're just protecting a shrinking number of people where the other side is persuading them, right? And so but I do think it's complicated. I am also not of the view that we gotta go to rural Ohio and get down on one knee and beg to white people to accept us. So I think there needs to be this total holding of the line about the dignity and rights of people of color and women and immigrants and gay people, whatever. But this effort to hold the line in a way that is persuasive rather than simply self-protective, that doesn't start with, here's why you could never get me, that starts with, here's what my experience is, and actually my experience implicates your values, and for your values, what you think this country is about, to be truly fulfilled, you need to incorporate my experiences, which actually point you to blind spots in your own vision. That is different from, here's why you'll never understand me.
Last question.
Hi.
I love how only people with party hats got to ask questions.
Yeah, it was a requirement, right? First of all, love the engine and crime scene analogies. I think it's so helpful for looking at problems in our society. But what I wanted to go back to was in the middle of your talk, you were saying something about how we're in the time of the greatest inequality, and then we were talking about the win-win stuff. And I would maybe argue that 300, 400 years ago, we had even greater inequality, and it was the accepted way of things. And now what's happening is there's a sense that it shouldn't be that way. And so that's the reaction of companies and billionaires and whatnot to try and make themselves look better, perhaps, but also maybe guilt and shame, or the feeling that each one of us have in this room probably is that things should be more equal. And I guess I wanted to hear what your thoughts were about morality and shame, or the shoulds, I guess.
That's a lot. Let me see what I can do in 20 seconds or less. So I didn't say it was the most unequal period in history. It's the most unequal America's been about 100 years. Essentially the most unequal we've been since we built a lot of the tools of modern life that were supposed to prevent this kind of inequality and hardship. And the word inequality makes people's eyes glaze over. So, one of the things I try to say is, I think about it as future hoarding. There's been an abundance of the future. If you look at the last 30, 40 years, there hasn't been a shortage of future. The future has come at us, right? Look at the companies, internet, genomics revolution. There's been a little too much future, if anything, right? But when the rain of the future has rained on us, the question is who basketed, who harvested the rainwater, right? And the very fortunate have basically harvested most of the rainwater of the future.
And they're packaging it in pretty bottles.
Exactly. And so when I think about the most unequal period in 100 years, 100 years ago we didn't have all these institutions that were supposed to mitigate this kind of, but now we do, and they're not working. And yeah, like our standards are higher because we don't, I don't think we should live in Downton Abbey, and our standards have been raised. And the reality is, like, the bottom half of Americans didn't get a raise since 1979. That's just abominable. Given the age we live in, it's unconscionable. It's just theft, plain and simple. In terms of guilt, last thing I'll say, guilt is a very powerful emotion. I spoke to a woman in the book whose name adorns a dozen buildings in New York City, Lori Tisch, and she's a billionaire, and she said, guilt is my compass, and I hope it never goes away. And even if you're not a billionaire, guilt can be very useful, and we should all have a lot of guilt, whether you did anything bad or not, living at the top of an unjust order. And I hope that guilt prompts all of us to think about not just making some difference in some people's lives, feeding some people, buying those shoes that are going to maybe go to Africa or probably not, but actually working towards building that age of reform that is going to make America work for most Americans again.
And we can do that. As designers, we can help redesign the future. I really believe that. It's up to us. Never before have we had the tools to be able to do this. Malcolm said that. And I think that we can and should move forward and redesign the way that the world works right now. Thank you.
You should run for president.
Oh. Anand Giridharadas.
Thank you.